Is the climate crisis unwinding? Well, some experts seem to think so. There seems to be more climate alarmists switching sides and becoming climate realists. The climate crisis doesn't seem to be quite as important as it used to be. And that CO2 issue? Well, maybe it's playing a smaller role than we really thought. It might be time for you to rethink your beliefs on climate change. And the economic health of the world really depends on us to have a closer look at this. You've probably heard the myth that 97% of scientists believe in climate change, and they also believe in anthropogenic CO2. The CO2 we're producing is causing that climate change. In fact, lately I've seen some papers take the 97% and bump it up to 99%. And then one news outlet even asked the question, does that 1% really exist? Trying to give the public the impression that everybody agrees on climate change, which is simply not true. This idea that 97% of scientists agree on climate change is a myth. I've had a close look at that in some of my past articles. There was never a survey of scientists to get that number. The researcher that came up with it simply looked at abstracts from research publications and was looking for specific words in that abstract. And if they found the words, they assumed that the scientists had certain beliefs one way or the other. And in fact, the math they used was incorrect. At most, 33% of scientists believed that CO2 was causing our warming. And even that may not be correct because there was never a survey done. What is clear is that more and more scientists are switching sides, and in this program I'd like to have a look at some of these and see what their opinions are today and compare that to what their opinions used to be. And of course, why did they switch sides? Let's have a look at Bill Gates. The story about Bill Gates is probably the best known of the recent climate defectors. He's been a leading promoter of the view that a warming climate is an existential crisis that demands urgent political action. But in a remarkable essay this year, he changes his view and reports there's a doomsday view of climate change that goes like this. In a few decades, cataclysmic climate change will decimate civilization. The evidence is all around us. Just look at all the heat waves and storms caused by rising global temperature. Nothing matters more than limiting the rise in temperature. He goes on to say, fortunately for all of us, this view is wrong. This essay has received a lot of publicity, and unfortunately, a lot of what people say is incorrect. He hasn't completely changed his mind on climate change. He still believes climate change is an issue, but A, other humanitarian issues are more important, and B, we need to stop wasting resources on fighting climate change the way we have been doing. Gates wrote, this is a chance to refocus on the metric that should count even more than emissions and temperature change, improving our lives. Our chief goal should be to prevent suffering, particularly for those in the toughest conditions who live in the world's poorest countries. Tom Harris, ex-climate alarmist. There is no climate crisis. Admittedly, this defection is not recent, but it rears its head frequently in the news. Tom Harris was a devoted climate alarmist until other fellow scientists at his Carleton University, which is located in Ottawa, started showing him the data. He's now a climate realist. Harris taught a climate change course for about 1,500 students over 4 terms, and he was heavily criticized for his climate view. He is the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition, a not-for-profit coalition of scientists, economists, and energy and policy experts working to promote a better understanding of climate science. Climate alarmists describe it as a group of climate change skeptics. But of course, any group that doesn't agree with them are called skeptics. As I was researching Tom Harris, I stumbled across Tom Harris number 2. He also promotes his ideas about climate change and on a part-time basis researches climate science, paleontology, and geology. He writes about his findings on a Substack called The Climate Uncovered. Tom Harris number 2 is a climate advocate, so don't get these two people mixed up. Ted Nordhaus. Ted Nordhaus, along with Michael Schellenberger, wrote the book Breakthrough in 2007, in which they said, over the next 50 years, if we continue to burn as much coal and oil as we've been burning, the heating of the earth will cause the sea levels to rise and the Amazon to collapse. And according to scenarios commissioned by the Pentagon, this will trigger a series of wars over the basic resources of food and water. Nordhaus no longer believes this and explains why in his article, Why I Stopped Being a Climate Catastrophist. He does believe the world will continue to warm as long as we keep burning fossil fuel, and sea levels will rise, but the catastrophic view is no longer believable. Michael Schellenberger has also changed his mind, and in 2020 published a new book, Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, in which he argues that climate change is not the existential threat it is betrayed to be. The book examines why the people who are most concerned about environmental problems tend to overstate the problem and oppose some of the best solutions. He still believes climate change is happening and that humans are impacting the environment in negative ways, but we are not in a crisis. Next on the list is Byron Lombor. He describes himself as an old left-wing Greenpeace member who was deeply concerned about the environmental issue and believed in an ever-deteriorating state of the world. In 1997, he read an article by Julian Simon in Wired magazine, which argued that official statistics showing doomsday environmental predictions to be incorrect. As a statistics instructor, Lombor initially intended to prove Simon wrong, believing that environmental declines were obvious. He formed a study group with students to check the data. Contrary to his expectations, his research suggested that many of Simon's claims were correct, leading him to shift from his environmentalist stance to a more skeptical, data-driven approach, which he outlined in the book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. If you're interested in hearing his opinions, he has a lot of YouTube videos. Leonard Bengtson is a famous scientist and has become a skeptic. He is the former director of the Hamburg-based Max Planck Institute for Meteorology. He was the recipient of the Milton Milankovitch Medal in 1996, and he is now Senior Research Fellow at the Environmental Systems Science Center at the University of Reading. He's certainly a very knowledgeable climate scientist. He has recently joined the Global Warming Policy Foundation, an organization known for its skepticism about climate change. When asked if the current warming is a crisis, he replied, "I don't think the current warming should be called a crisis. Global food production, for example, is increasing. And despite a rapidly growing population and continuing warming, far fewer people die as a result of the extreme weather than in the past. Nevertheless, we do need long-term and systematic action to reduce global greenhouse gases to curb warming." When asked by Die Welt, a German newspaper, on June 15th of 2022 about the two biggest problems caused by global warming, he replied, "Sea level rises are problematic in some areas, but that could be countered by the construction of coastal defenses. Changes in precipitation are all the more serious. However, there is no clear empirical evidence that such changes have taken place. They are also very difficult to separate from random natural events." The last person I'd like to have a look at is Robert Pavlis. That's right, that's me. Now, I'm not claiming I'm in the same class as the other people I've mentioned, but I think my journey with climate change may be of interest. I used to believe the headlines. CO2 is causing warming, the warming is causing climate change, etc. Seemed to make kind of sense, and that's what everybody was saying. For those who know me, I have a background in science, chemistry and biochemistry, and over the last 15 years, I spent a lot of time debunking gardening myths. So what I do is I look at the myth, some belief that gardeners have, and then I go and look at the science that supports the ideas. Does the science support the claims that people are making? And in many cases, I found that there's no scientific support at all. There's just lots and lots of gardening myths. And gardening isn't unique here, it just happens to be an area that I know a lot about. So what I decided to do one day was to apply that same process, that same technique to climate change. Let's have a look at the data. What does the data tell us? Is there data that supports the idea that the climate is changing? And I was very surprised at the results. There is data to support the idea that we are warming, but not nearly to the extent that many people have claimed. I really can't find any evidence that the majority of that warming is due to the CO2 we produce. Lots of people say that's true, but try and find some data that actually supports that. And when it comes to other areas of climate change, other than the warming issue, I found very, very little support. I then wrote an article, Is Climate Change Real? And presented all the data that I found. And if you look at that data, the only conclusion you can reach is there is no climate change, except for the global warming part. Now, I'm not a climate scientist, but I am able to look at a simple chart and see what the yearly temperatures are and see if they're going up or down. Or in the case of forest fires, are the number of forest fires coming down? In my report, I don't generate any of the data. I leave that up to the climate scientists. All I'm doing is looking at the results that they present and deciding, is there a trend? Is it trending up? Is it trending down? Or is it about the same? And in almost every case that I looked at, there's no trend up or down. That indicates to me that there's no great climate change taking place. I hope you'll take the time to look at the data and make your own decision. You just might be the next person who switches sides from being an alarmist to being a realist. Thanks for watching. You can find Reality Time on YouTube, Substack, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I'll put links to these and our social pages in the description below. If you're interested in gardening, check out my YouTube channel called Garden Fundamentals or my blog called Garden Myths. Let the truth shine into your life.